So it's a huge pleasure for me to introduce John for his professorial lecture. I first encountered John when I was teaching him on his second year undergraduate social psychology course, and we were looking at crowd behaviour. In those days, we were starting from criticising the work of Gustave Le Bon, who you might be talking about, who talked about crowds as a mob mentality. And John's going to give us a very different picture from that today, I think. He did his essay on the St Paul's Bristol riots in 1980, and I gave him an A minus. Always like to leave a little bit of room for improvement, but I like to think that I can spot a good student, and really did. John's work really, to me, is a masterclass in combining academic work of really interesting advances in theory together with really important practical implications. And I think he's a really good example to follow in terms of that link between theory and practice. I'm not going to talk about all the great research he's done, because he's going to tell us about that, or his contribution to the public good. He was very active during the pandemic on stage advisory groups and SPI-B. But I think hopefully what you'll see from his lecture is the way that he's married together pioneering theory with really interesting and important practice. Yeah, and I think in terms of his work in the School of Psychology, he's an incredibly good colleague. I saw at quite close quarters the work that he did on the REF and the impact work, and that was really, all that leadership and hard work. So John is also a great colleague. So I'm going to stop now and hand over to John, who's going to tell us about why crowd behaviour matters.
Great, thanks very much, Nicola. So this talk is about crowds, and it's one of those topics in psychology that everyone has an opinion on, it seems. But what we think about crowds, our views on crowds, matter. They matter for sometimes how we think about ourselves and our human nature. Do crowds elevate us, or do they reduce us to savages? How we think about crowds also can matter for policy and practice, and in the strategies and management practices we use in the social arena. So this is a kind of crowd psychology's greatest hits, or at least some of crowd psychology's greatest hits, because it's a personalised account of some of the areas of research that have inspired me and fascinated me over the last 30 years or so. And it's those areas that have fascinated me, but also that bring together why crowd behaviour matters in different ways. And I divided it into 3 topic areas. And the first is identity change in collective action. And by collective action, what we typically mean in social psychology is protests and riots, that kind of thing. The second area is how people behave in mass emergencies. Do they lose control of their behaviour, or is there a basis in crowd psychology for a resilient response? And the final area is some recent work we've been doing on social influence, the way that certain kinds of collective action events influence the likelihood of further collective action events. So going back to when I first came to Sussex, and back in the 80s, everything was in black and white. So the first topic is this identity change in collective action. So I didn't come here to study crowds. I came here because I wanted to be a psychoanalyst when I was an undergraduate. And one of the things that changed my mind and reshaped where I wanted to go was Steve Reicher's study that Nicola mentioned of the St Paul's riot in 1980. And I still regard that as the most important, most influential study of crowd behaviour. Now, to put that in context, when that landmark study came out, the orthodoxy in psychology was something that I'm calling here the mob mentality approach, as Nicola mentioned, associated with the name of Gustave Le Bon and the early crowd psychologists in late 19th century France who first developed the subdiscipline. But in the 1980s and 90s, it was associated with the de-individuation family of theories. So this family of theories suggested that in crowds, people lose control of their behavior because they've lost their self, they've lost their personality, they become more psychologically primitive, and the end result tends to be indiscriminate, violent behavior in crowds. Crowds are typically mindless and violent. And against this idea, Reicher's study of the St. Paul's riot showed by looking at archive material, interviews, observations, that what happened, even the most violent crowd event, there was a pattern. There were limitations, and that pattern and those limitations reflected the definition of social identity shared by the participants. That is what it means to be a resident of St. Paul's. So just as we all have individual identities, personal identities, we also have social identities, which are the identities we get from our group memberships. And these provide definitions of appropriate conduct. So the targets, the particular people attacked, and it was mostly the police and some press, the buildings that were damaged and the buildings that were not damaged, reflected the understandings of the residents of St. Paul's as in a historically antagonistic relationship with the police over many years. So two thoughts came out of reading this study, and the first was the sheer amazement and delight, really, that crowds and riots, which had fascinated me for years, could be the study of academic research. You could go to university and look at crowds and riots. This was an amazing revelation, but also I thought, well, I wish I'd written that, and this person's got there first. So as I hadn't written it, I did the next best thing as I went to Exeter University to work with Steve Reicher as his PhD student. As you can see, Exeter University, beautiful campus, possibly even more beautiful than Sussex. Even the conveniences in the psychology building. And so I've also pictured there, that's Steve Reicher in the middle, and I've also pictured there Clifford Stott, who was Steve Reicher's PhD student just before me, who encouraged me to work with Steve. And these two have been my closest collaborators ever since, and many of the ideas I'm going to be sharing with you today, they are joint authors on. So the St. Paul's study, what the St. Paul's study showed theoretically is that in crowd events like riots, people shift from a personal identity to a collective identity, a social identity. They shift from one to the other. But we wanted to go further, and this is what I tried to do in my first research with Steve Reicher in Exeter, because we wanted to find and examine the psychology between behind a phenomenon that had been noted and described by many other disciplines. So in history, autobiography, politics, and other disciplines, it had been shown that some participants are transformed after the event through being involved in crowd events. They become more empowered, politicized, they change who they are through getting involved in some crowd events. Not most people, not most events, but it happens and it's documented and we wanted to understand it. I've got the pictures of the 1984-5 miners' strike on the slide there because that was some of the reading around that provided plenty of examples, and particularly the miners' wives, where these kind of transformative experiences were occurring. They left their marriages, they went to university, all sorts of things. In fact, I interviewed a couple, a miner and a ex-miner and his wife when I started doing my PhD and heard some very powerful experiences like that. So the question was, how does this happen? What is it, if anything, about what happens in crowds and crowd psychology that might contribute to this? So in this period in the 1990s, Steve and Clifford and I worked on something that became known as the elaborated social identity model. And my ethnographic work on the No M11 Link Road campaign, along with a number of other studies, identified a pattern that seems to explain some of these changes. And by the way, if you read The Guardian today, you'll see an article about the No M11 Link Road campaign, because this week is the 30th anniversary of the eviction of Claremont Road. So do have a read of that. It's a very powerful account. And by the way, I know many people here are not psychologists, so I should say a word or two about method. When I say ethnography, I mean participant observation. It means going to the event and becoming involved as a participant and gathering your data, whether it's observations or interviews, that way. So there was this pattern that we identified at these events and many others. And the first step in the pattern, the first part of it, was you've got a mixed crowd, a fairly mixed crowd. And at the No 11 Link Road in London, it was some activists who come down to London, plus some local people, local, respectable, middle-class, middle-aged people who saw themselves as different groups. They both were there to stop the road being built, but they were different groups. But they were treated in an identical way by the authorities, and in a way that was unfair too, that discriminated against them as a crowd. And so the first change that came about was to change the way that people saw each other within the crowd, because they started to see that they're actually the same people. We're not so different from the activists. We, local people, local residents, are the same as the activists in some way, and start to form a new group. Now, in that new group, there was a basis for the second part of the change process, which we call empowerment. Because if you're in the same group as a large number of other people who see you as one of them, you can expect support from them to do actions which are in line with the definition of identity. So to the extent that we're all against the road being built, then I would expect support for action to stop the road being built, such as occupying the land, pushing the fences down of the construction site, and even reclaiming the site as common land by replacing the earth that's been dug up by the mechanical diggers. And that last stage of the process was a profound experience for many people who took that sense of empowerment they experienced that day into other areas of their lives, seeing themselves as agents for the first time perhaps in their lives, and feeling a new sense of agency by seeing the world transformed in line with their ideas and their identity. So why does any of this matter? So a first reason why it matters is that mob mentality idea I mentioned at the beginning, that people lose their identity, they lose control, their behaviour is meaningless, it tends towards violence in a crowd. That has served as a rationale for violent policing of crowds for decades, for centuries, in fact. And it's because if the authorities think that the crowd is mindless, think that you can't communicate with the crowd, then violence against the crowd is the only management strategy left to them. And the second reason I think that these ideas matter is because they speak to the psychology of social change. They show the role of the crowd and of social identity as a kind of hinge between certain kinds of experiences and actions and wider processes of social change. So for those people that came to see themselves as part of the same group as these activists, they now also connected with a wider movement. It wasn't just about stopping the road in Wanstead, a small part of London. It was about stopping the anti-roads programme. It was about the climate crisis. It was about injustice nationally. But not only that, they were connected with a wider movement that actually empowered them to do those things. And some of those people went on to get involved in things like the anti-capitalist movement in the early 2000s. So that was my first topic, and moving on to the second of my three crowd topics. So shortly after finishing the PhD in 1997, I came back to Sussex. And after a few years, we were encouraged by the success that the social identity approach had provided in relation to crowds in riots and protests and direct actions. So we began to think about how these principles could be applied to another kind of spontaneous, kind of unstructured crowd, which was the crowd involved in mass emergencies. Now, this was a topic that, you know, when I started researching and reading about it and hearing people's stories, it was one with many harrowing examples, many upsetting examples, really. But also, it's a topic with many really uplifting tales, many uplifting examples that make you think about, you know, how good human nature can be. But it was also one of those crowd events where there was already an orthodoxy and already a set of ideas which were prevalent in common sense language, in the mass media, and to some extent in academia, that characterized the crowd as a problem due to its psychology. And that idea was mass panic. I thought someone was going to shout it out. So, in fact, social scientists for a very long time had been criticizing, we weren't the first to criticize this idea. Sociologists and others have been criticizing it for decades. And one of the many problems with the mass panic idea as an account of what happens in mass emergencies is the idea that it suggests that people typically overreact in emergencies. And this is the reason why people die, why there's so many injuries. And in fact, the real problem is not actually that. And any person like in the fire service will tell you, the real problem is the opposite. So if the fire alarm goes off now, what are you going to do? That's the right, leave is the right answer. But most people, you will hesitate, you'll probably sit there waiting. That's the wrong answer. This is what happens. This is the real danger. People discount the signals of risk and danger, fire alarms and other signs of impending emergency. So that's one issue. And the another fundamental problem of the idea of mass panic, and the one I'm going to focus on now, is the claim it makes that behaviour in emergencies is typically selfish, competitive, people pushing and shoving each other aside as a default. Problem here is that cooperation is incredibly common. Not every emergency, not every person, but common enough that's been documented time and time again. And I've got on the slide there two very upsetting disasters. In fact, we interviewed some of the survivors from Hillsborough. But the reason I've got these two disasters on the slide is because these are both crushing incidents where it was physically difficult for people in the crowd to help each other. Just, you know, if you were hemmed in, how can you help? In fact, you can see with Hillsborough, people were, if they were physically able, helping each other. But in both these cases, there was the impulse to help. So the survivors said, well, I wanted to, I tried to, I had the desire to help. So that impulse, that desire is so strong that it exists even when it's physically difficult for people to do so. So the question is, why does this happen? Why do people help each other? Why do they take the time? Because if you think about it, it might be easier, it might make more sense for you to look after number one, just be concerned with your own safety, because all the time you spend helping others could be delaying your own exit. So in the literature, there are two main answers to why it is that people help each other. The first is called social capital. And this is the idea that in an emergency, people are often with people they already know, people they have bonds with, people they care about already, and they draw upon this to get help and to help each other. And the second kind of reason suggests that in emergencies, sometimes people form new bonds. they become new groups within the emergency itself. And that has been my interest and focus over the last X number of years. So now I want to tell you about a study that examined the psychology of this. How does this happen? How do people form new groups? Why do they form new groups when they don't have connections with people? So this is one of the first studies we carried out to address this question. And it was a study looking at the experiences and behaviour of survivors of the 7th of July 2005 London bombings. Now, as you might recall, there were 4 bombs, 3 on the London Underground and 1 on a London bus. 56 people were killed, including the bombers. And the survivors were literally and figuratively left in the dark for a period of time because the emergency services didn't get to them. So what did they do? So one of the first things we did was simply, in the interviews and in the accounts in the official inquiry, which contained very detailed accounts of what happened, we looked at how many instances of what might be broadly be called helping behaviour or cooperative behaviour occurred versus how many incidents of what might count as selfish behaviour occurred. And by helping behaviour, we count a range of things here, including overt helping, such as people with skills who would tie tourniquets, as well as things like giving reassurance, giving emotional support, sharing bottles of water, physically supporting people, and so on. And by selfish behaviour, we had examples like somebody asked for help and it was ignored. And you can see whichever way it's counted, whether people report giving help, whether they report seeing help, or whether they report being helped, it massively outweighs reports of selfish behaviour. So I've got an example here, to give you a second to read that. So I really like this example, and there's a couple of reasons why. One point it makes is that much of the cooperative or helpful behaviour that serves to save lives in emergency is not actually of the heroic type. I mean, we did find examples of kind of heroic help, but a lot of it was a bit more like this, a bit more kind of mundane, because he's allowing him to go first as people are filing out of the exits. And in fact, the evacuation of the Twin Towers in 9/11 was very similar to this. It wasn't the fire service who heroically saved people. It wasn't heroism there. It was people simply moving in a coordinated way down the steps. So that's the first point. That coordinated behaviour can save lives. It probably saves more lives than heroic behaviour. And the second point is there is an element of, in his perception of how he's being treated, emotional support. He sees this as a gesture of care from the other person, and he's touched by that. And that's important too, because emotional support is one of the things that actually predicts people recovering in the period after, recovering psychologically in the period after emergencies and disasters. So why did people help each other? Well, one reason might be because the bombs had already gone off, perhaps there was no cost to giving help. Perhaps there was no risk to giving help. If you look at the first 2 lines here, most people who spoke about it said that they felt they were in danger of death. They did not feel safe, even though the bombs had gone off. And very few felt they were now kind of out of danger. And, you know, that's understandable, right? Because you know, if a bomb goes off, your world is shattered. You don't feel safe. And they gave specific examples of things that they were frightened of. I thought there might be another bomb. I thought a train might come down the track. I thought I might get electrocuted. All sorts of reasons. But still, there was lots of examples of help. The other reason why people might help goes back to the social capital idea. So were people with family and friends, were they with people who already cared about them and they cared about? Well, these bombings took place in rush hour. So most people were commuters. They weren't with family and friends. And you can see that in the bottom 2 lines. Most people were with strangers, people they had no commitment to, and yet still there was all these examples of helping. So our suggestion is that what happened was there was a shift from personal identity, like you go on the tube, right, and you feel, I'm just, thinking of me, to a group identity that happened through the event itself. And there's some evidence for this in people's accounts. When we asked them, tell me about, your relationship with those around you, immediately before the bomb had gone off when you're sitting on the tube train, and then tell us about it afterwards. So one of our people said, when asked whether there was any unity before the bomb had gone off and you're just sitting on the train, I'd say no, there was very little unity, 3 out of 10. I mean, you don't really think about unity on a normal train journey. It just doesn't happen. You just want to get from A to B, get a seat. So psychologically, in social identity terms, the identity is just me in relation to other individuals. They're focused on their personal identity, understandably. But when they spoke about their experience and their relationship with other people around them in the period immediately after the explosion, you can see in their responses a spontaneous set of references to what we call we-ness, a rich vocabulary of we-ness, in fact. People talked about a unity, togetherness, similarity, affinity, part of a group. Everybody, didn't matter what colour or nationality. You thought these people knew each other, teamness, warmness, vague solidity, empathy. So now, psychologically, it's an us. We are grouped together in relation to the bomb blast. So here's a few numbers. These numbers are low, but they kind of fit in with this pattern that there were few reports of disunity, number of reports of seeing and feeling unity. And when I say shared fate, I mean, people would say things like, we were all in the same boat. And being all in the same boat grouped people together, made them feel that others were having the same identity as them. And indeed, reports of shared identity were associated with reports of helping. So that was a single case study. And so we carried out a number of other studies, and in these studies we found convergent evidence for the same kind of idea. So one thing we did was we interviewed survivors of a range of different kinds of emergencies and disasters, and there was a lot more variability in how much unity people felt and how much help people gave. But here again, across a range of events, whether it's sinking ships, terrorist attacks, fires, train crashes, football stadium crashes, the more that people felt that there was shared identity in the crowd, they shared identity with the crowd, the more reports of helping that there were, and those reports of shared social identity were associated with a sense of common fate. We also carried out experiments using virtual reality technology, which kind of found the same relationship, but this also enabled us to look at more actively selfish behaviour, such as pushing, which was found to be low when there was low identification in the crowd. And the beauty of this, and why we do this kind of study, is because you can manipulate and control the level of identity and the level of common fate and then measure the effects. So on the basis of these studies and others, we developed this model, this set of boxes and arrows, which has now been tested in a very large number of other emergencies and disasters using survey methods, large questionnaires with large samples, some of them representative. And you can see shared social identity is at the center of this, because shared social identity, my sense of being in the same group as others, and they see me as a group member too, is the basis of motivations. I care about these others because they're part of my group and therefore I want to help them. I care about what happens to them, but also beliefs and perceptions. Because these people are in my group, they will care about what happens to me. So I would expect support from them, which also enables us to act in a kind of coordinated way. So why does this matter? So at this point, I want to acknowledge the role of a number of people from early on recognised that these findings mattered and they had practical consequences, and realised that because when we plan the response to an emergency, whether it's the emergency services or the health service, whatever it is, we have ideas in our mind about how people behave in crowds, and we need to be accurate about those ideas. So I want to acknowledge here Chris Cocking, who was a colleague when we started doing the London bombings research, Richard Williams, who was writing the guidance for the Department of Health on psychosocial care when I met him in 2008 and started including our research in that guidance, and Richard Amlow, who was then in the Health Protection Agency and saw the relevance of this work for how emergencies were managed by the emergency services. I've also got their colleagues from the event safety industry, Chris Kemp and Keith Steele and Andy Hollinson, who have, in their different ways, included this in the training that goes to crowd safety professionals. So why does it matter? It matters to get it right, because if we believe that the crowd panics in emergencies, that provides a rationale for not telling people that there's a threat. Don't tell them, they'll only panic. If you do that, when people think there's something going on or something wrong, it basically increases their anxiety. And the best way to reduce anxiety is to actually give people information about what's going on. But not only that, if they think that you are withholding information from them, which you might be in this occasion, then not only that, they start to distrust the authorities, right? So when you do give information to them, like correct information, they might not believe it. So it damages the relationship. It reduces the capacity of people in the public to respond adequately, and it damages the trust that they might have in the authorities. It can become a vicious circle too, because then the authorities see the crowd becoming anxious. They say, there, I was right. It's crowd panic. Withhold information. But if the crowd is not part of the problem, but is part of the solution in emergencies, then some basic principles follow from the research and the model that I've been talking about. And the first of these is, well, communicate with the crowd. It's important to give people information to empower them to take the right action. So prioritize communication, information. Secondly, if shared identity is this key mechanism that allows people to behave in this adaptive, cooperative way, and remember, the crowd are the first people there rather than the emergency services, then whatever you do, don't undermine that shared identity. Try to support it if you can. Sometimes the language used is individualizing by the authorities, and so the argument is to use the opposite, trying to collectivize through your language. But thirdly, to build shared identity at some level between the crowd, the public, and the authorities or the emergency services, to treat the crowd as a partner rather than someone simply to be managed in a kind of top-down way. So a kind of inclusive approach to responding to emergencies. And these ideas, I've got these things at the bottom here because the fire service, the Cabinet Office and the Square Meter Group, who deal with crowd safety, are now using some of these ideas in their work. So 8 years ago, moving on to the final area where crowd behaviour matters, in its social influence between crowd events. And we know that behaviour spreads between people. Right, this was the test, and no one's actually scratching their ear. So behaviour spreads between people sometimes, and this is important actually, not always, not all the time. It's not automatic, is it? It can't be. So contagion is a way of talking about the spread of behaviour between people and between events. And God, it's so popular. In academia, it is so massively popular. I mean, if you do a Google Scholar search, looking for the word contagion in the title of journal articles, I mean, I did this recently, And I found 700 of them in 2022 alone. And they're not about disease, they're about behaviour. So it's a really popular concept, but I want to persuade you in this final topic that that concept conceals more than it reveals about how behaviour spreads, particularly when we're looking at crowd events, and that there are better ways of talking about and understanding social influence between crowd events. So in the 1990s, I was inspired by discourse analysis, which is the study of how people do things with words. And we can use one of the techniques of discourse analysis to think about why we might want to go beyond the contagion concept. And the technique is quite simple. It's to substitute another word such as diffusion or spread for that word contagion, and then think, what does the term contagion give you that those words don't? So it constructs that wave of collective action, if that's what we're talking about, as like an illness, like a disease, as something bad, as something automatic, something unthinking. And then you might ask, in whose interests is it to talk about that phenomenon in that way, to compare, for example, Black Lives Matter to a disease, to pathologize that phenomenon? It was no coincidence that the early crowd theorists, and I've got them on the slide again there, in the late 19th century, used the language of disease and illness to talk about crowds and to construct crowd science, because they regarded the working class crowds who were on the streets as a sickness in society. So you might say, well, that's interesting, but is it right? Does behaviour spread in the way the contagion concept suggests? So what does the contagion concept mean? It means about emotions and behaviour spread simply through contact or exposure. That is the distinguishing idea. And the short answer is no, it doesn't really, because there are lots of examples of group boundaries to emotional and behavioural spread. Stanley Milgram wrote a very good book chapter about crowd behaviour in the 1960s, and he said, if contagion was right, why is it that when you've got a crowd demagogue who is addressing the crowd, the emotion that spreads to the crowd doesn't spread to the riot police who behave in a different way? And you can observe the same thing if you look at a football crowd, which is physically together in the same space. The emotional response of one part of the crowd to their team's goal doesn't spread to the rest of the crowd. So there are lots of other examples, and experimental social psychology too. But the sociologists and historians who have done most of the work in looking at the spread of events from place to place have shown statistically that collective action events such as riots can make other events in other locations more likely over and above the grievance shared by the different locations. And this, by the way, is some pictures of the swing riots from 1830, which spread across the southeast of England. So the question is, how does this happen? If it's not contagion, if it's not mindless contagion, what is it? So for the last 8 years, we've been looking at waves of riots in order to try to answer this question with two big projects. First of all, we had a project focusing on the 2011 riots, which you might remember started with the police killing of Mark Duggan, a mixed heritage man in North London, and anti-police sentiment was a strong element across those riots, which involved dozens of towns and cities and significant property damage. You might be less familiar with the 1831 reform riots, which was the subject of our second big project. These were about a piece of legislation that was thought to be progressive, that the House of Lords rejected, leading to people, particularly kind of working class or proto-working class people, protesting and then rioting against those privileged people in their local areas who were seen to have scuppered and benefited from the failure of that legislation. So obviously we had access to interview data for people who took part in 2011 because they're still alive. We didn't have that for people in 1831, but we had a great access to archive data. And in both projects, we worked with historians using their skills to provide some of the analysis. So in these studies, we identified a variety of psychological processes linking different events. So in 2011, the rioting began in Tottenham in North London, and the first location in South London that rioting spread to was Brixton. And there was something very particular about Brixton participants' understanding of their relationship with Tottenham that we didn't find in other locations so much. They talked about the common history between themselves and Tottenham. They both had a history of police racism against people in the two areas and of rising up against the police in the two areas. They felt angry, people in Brixton, about what had happened in Tottenham, the killing by the police of Mark Duggan. They felt it could have been them. And so what they did in Brixton was a retaliation against the police. So we call this a cognitive pathway because it's a very, very social identity based pathway. People knew what to do, knew what it was right to do by knowing who they were, by thinking about their identity in Brixton as a community. We found something parallel to this when we looked at the 1831 riots, particularly when we looked at the relationship between the riots in Bristol, Bath and Newport. So the Newport and Bath riots came after the Bristol riot, and here again we found a strong sense of common identity. People in Bath and Newport seemed to care about Bristol. They had family connections with Bristol, and they were motivated to do something slightly different than they did in Brixton. Because in those days, you didn't really have the police, you had the troops, right? And the troops were being sent from across the southwest to go to Bristol to put down the riots there. And the people in Bath and Newport put their lives on the line to stop the troops going to Bristol. And what happened then was a riot to stop that movement of troops. And stop them getting on this boat, in fact, and crossing over the Bristol Channel. So these were solidarity riots, preemptive solidarity riots, not retaliative solidarity riots. And the second kind of pathway was one we found in other parts of London where people didn't identify with Tottenham, but they were hostile to the police. Remember I said that hostility to the police was a major theme. And when they saw that the police in Brixton and other places were becoming weakened, they became empowered, and they rioted in their local area because they realised that police in their area would be unable to do anything about it. Now, in many of these, and this is a crucial psychological hinge between these different events, because in many of these case studies, there was a common social influence process that occurred locally. We sometimes think that this influence from location to location is just this direct pathway. So there's a protest in another area, and that makes you think that you will protest in your area. But in fact, what happens is when the event happens in the other area, people say, what are my peers going to do? My peers are angry. My peers are empowered. My network is feeling angry about this. My network will come onto the streets. And that belief about others' beliefs, meta-perception, was actually the main thing that led people to take action themselves, the most important influence on their own decision. And finally, on the research here, we also found that the police had meta-perceptions too. And in a final pathway, we found in Salford in Greater Manchester, many people, local people there, didn't see the relevance of the other riots, the riots in London. That's not relevant for us. But the police had very strong beliefs that local people would be influenced, a kind of copycat approach. They imagined a kind of contagion approach. They believed that locals would gather. So they preemptively mobilised into Salford. That mobilisation drew a crowd thinking, what's going on? Why are they here? And when the police intervened, there were enough people who were already hostile to the police to fight back. So that riot was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Why does this matter? So this summer, we've seen a wave of racist riots across parts of England. And this is something we are looking at the moment. But one of the things I think is going on here is that people in these events believed that enough local people feel the same way as them, and that encouraged them to come out onto the streets. Particularly when you've had several, notice the way the riots over the summer escalated, and there was a high point when many took part on that Saturday, believing, look, it's everywhere now. Many people think like this. My neighbours think like this. So why does this matter practically? Because it points us to part of a solution. Because I think one of the ways that the counter mobilisations worked, and if you remember, it was the Wednesday, that Wednesday when there were massive counter mobilisations across the country of hundreds of people, and this is the picture from Queen's Road in Brighton. What does that do? It creates the sense that the local community is not predominantly racist, or it doesn't not care about racist attacks. So it could serve the function of disabusing the racists that their opinions are widely shared in their local community, that they don't reflect a public opinion. So I'm coming to the end. So here are some final reflections, some reflections on the trajectory, the way that crowd behaviour research, crowd psychology research has developed over the 30 or so years I've been doing it. And I'm not claiming credit for this, but I've been lucky enough to be part of it and to witnessed it. And one thing that's happened is that more and more people are doing the research and more research is being published. And you can see that in the sheer number of papers being published on the topic. A second way you notice it is in the disciplines in particular. It used to be the case that people doing modelling and engineering would draw upon antiquated psychologies of the crowd and have that as their psychology in their engineering models. And increasingly, they're drawing upon modern social psychology. So that's another great development. And the third area of growth is in the topic. This is more important than the number of papers, is the number of different topics. So I've been talking about kind of crisis crowds today, but in fact, we're talking about mass gatherings, ceremonies, queues, music events, sports crowds. Loads of types of crowds are being researched today. So that's another great thing. So coming near the end, very near the end, so I need to have some final acknowledgements. And research really is a collaborative enterprise. I mean, this is kind of my professorial, and that's great. But everything I've done is as part of a team, and it's a very, very big team overall. And we've got this crowds and identities as a kind of family, and these are the PhD students and the postdocs that I had the privilege to work with and to learn from. And if we're talking about families, I also want to acknowledge the family for their interest in what I do and their continuous curiosity about what I do as a researcher. So thank you to them too. So what are my take-home messages? I've got two take-home, I should have three, but I'm going to have two, just to be short. Two take-home messages. So I've talked about the conflictual crowd, the helpful crowd, the influential crowd. And in all of these kinds of crowds and many others, the social identity concept, the idea that one of our sources of identity is the groups that we belong to, has been absolutely crucial. It's been so helpful in moving us forward and understanding these phenomena. And the final thing to say, and this is something I say to my students when we get to the end of the module on crowd behaviour, I say, I want you to be suspicious and sceptical. When you see in the media the reference to the mob mentality, to to the pathological crowd, to the panicking crowd, to the mindless crowd. Be skeptical, be critical. And with a social identity concept and with this body of research that you've been exposed to now, you have the tools to talk about the crowd in a different way and to think about the crowd in a more accurate way, but also in a more liberatory way. Thanks very much.